was at the age of 14, my parents took me on a big history tour of the country, Washington and stuff like that. And it was there, and I was interested in history from the age of 7, really, I remember that. But it was at the age of 14 when I watched the docents at Williamsburg, and I said, you know what? That's what I want to do. I want to literally be a docent. It took a long time, but that's what I'm doing now as a volunteer. So let's get to the show, okay? I'll be making 1, 2, 3 transitions, all right? And I'll let you know when those are happening. You should be able to see this. So let's get started. Okay. Thank you. Okay, this is the title of my book, Boats Against the Current. So you have to start off with a shameless author plug. That's what one does. And these are the Fitzgeralds on their honeymoon. Actually, Slater. I'm going to talk about that. That's important to the story. And that's the house they stayed in Westport, Connecticut. What's this story I'm about to tell you about? Well, I used the title Boats Against the Current because that's in the last sentence of The Great Gatsby. But 45 years ago, when I started this quest to prove how important the Fitzgeralds' time here was to their works, all I did was face resistance. And in the 7 years it took to research and write the book and make the film, famously, one Fitzgerald academic said, Deej, if you get Westport in the top 25 places that are important to Fitzgerald's work, it's a noble and it's a lost cause. But lo and behold, by just reading everything they wrote and reading everything that was written about them, what I found was that they wrote about it the most. Now that sounds like it was a difficult task. It was a glorious task to be able to read them. I'll be starting off quickly and moving fast through what Charles Scribner called the dry run for the Great Gatsby. And that's The Beautiful and Damned. He wrote half of it in Westport. Half of it takes place in Westport, the fictional town of Marietta. It is almost completely autobiographical about their early marriage. And as Scott Fitzgerald said, all my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. Zelda wrote also about her 2 characters' young marriage in Say Me the Waltz, also features Westport. In Scandelabra, she takes the premise of The Beautiful and Damned and reverses it. In 5 of his short stories, Westport's in it. In one of his great stories, The Cruise of the Rolling Junk, which I encourage you to read, and I think you'd really like it, is Westport. And of course, I'm going to show you that it's in The Great Gatsby. On some level, if you're not a Fitzgerald buff, you can ask yourself, well, why watch this? I'll give you one selling point. I, in the book, and we, my film partner and I, when we were trying to prove this, what happened was we went up against the single most important Fitzgerald biographer there was, a guy by the name of Matthew Broccoli, who completely rejected the Westport thesis. And so it's a story about not only, I used to tell my students, don't believe everything you read and all that stuff, look for yourself. And this is about looking for yourself. It's about challenging authority, and it's about being told no and persevering. Okay, here they are. They were married in April of 1920. They are here in Westport 5 weeks later for their honeymoon. She's 19, keep that in mind. He's 24, they're kids. She's a college kid. He's post-grad. She never went to college and he got thrown out, but that's another story. They did a signal sort of achievement. They got thrown out of the city of New York. I have not read before or since anybody getting thrown out of the city of New York, but they did, and here's how they did it. They stayed at the Biltmore, they stayed at the Commodore hotels, they got thrown out of both. The last straw in one of the hotels was that they abused a brand new invention. It was called the revolving door, and they giddily revolved in that door for 30 minutes. Nobody could get in and out, and that was it. So what did they do? They decided to go pursue their honeymoon. They jump in a used Marmon. They basically take a right off the post road and more or less accidentally end up in Westport. Here is where he writes the main chunk of The Beautiful and Damned. This is his least read novel. So guess what? For cocktail party points, and I hope we all are going to be attending those at some point soon, it's fun to read The Beautiful and Damned, and as I'm going to show you, it's the dry run for The Great Gatsby. What I love is what Scott said about the cover of this book. He said, he did a good job with the girl, the artist, but he did a rather debauched version of me. I think he looks pretty good. I want to point out that when they were here exactly a century ago, they faced three challenges as Americans. One, an epidemic in which the only protection was a mask. That was influenza, not to, of course, make light of COVID, but that killed 50 million people worldwide. That was one thing. Number two, the worst race riots since Reconstruction in 32 American cities, when a time when Black lives did not matter, and in one of the greatest depressions in American history. So, you know, that's all in the background, right? And here they are. Now, what I'm going to do is what I would call bad teaching, okay? You're going to have to read while I talk because I'm going to move fast during this segment because I know we all want to get to Gatsby. But again, what he writes in The Beautiful and Damned, including about their house that they stayed, is purely autobiographical. It was a pre-revolutionary house. It was owned by the Gray family. It was painted gray then, and it's painted gray today. And I just love how he describes how old the house is with this wonderful, wonderful prose. Again, still there in its entirety. It's had an add-on in the back, but it's intact. I lead very popular Gatsby tours, spring, summer, and fall in Westport through the Westport Historical Society. If you're ever in town, it's a beautiful 4-mile walk, 2.5 miles total through some of the most beautiful country you'll see, and I'll show you where scenes in The Beautiful and Damned and Gatsby happened. All right, this is going to be overwhelming to you, and don't worry, just sit back. I'll be explaining this in some detail as we move forward. Right now, it just looks like a big giant salad. But this was the root of a character's escape in The Beautiful and Damned. And in just a minute, I will get into that. And I traced it via Google Earth. But this goes back to when I was 14, and you know, this was my neighborhood. I grew up a 1/4 mile away from their house. I now live a 1/2 mile away from their house. And when I read The Beautiful and Damned, I was stunned to read a roadmap of Westport. Characters are taking a left here, they're taking a right here, they're going to the beach, you know, it was a roadmap. As Walter Robichek said, it's the greatest example of 20th century literature of a book reflecting the geography it was written in. So I thought I made a big discovery, and then the internet, somebody had the audacity to invent that, and I found out that I was not unique with that interpretation. It was pretty much common knowledge. I thought about Gatsby, kind of put a couple of things together, but it took somebody else to help me on that journey, and I'll talk about that in a second. So watch. When I talk about Gloria Patch and Anthony Patch in The Beautiful and Damned, the young married newlywed honeymoon couples, I'm talking about Zelda and Scott, all right? Again, all my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. And by the way, most of his female ones were Zelda. So the following passage actually happened step by step in their real life. I'll take you really quickly through this slide. Okay, here they are at the Fitzgerald house, bottom right. Zelda, it was a big giant party they were having, and one of the problems was that one of Scott's roommates, ex-roommates from Princeton, began to hit on her, and she ran out of the house, and Scott was right behind her. So Gloria Patch, after she gets hit on by a character, runs up this road, I'll show you that, runs down this road over here to the train bridge, and to the train station. So let's get at it. And again, I'm going to move fast. So again, and I'm only showing you very isolated quotes from The Beautiful and Damned, okay? Just so you know. So it's much more descriptive than you see. She rounds the house, goes to the road, there it is. And sure enough, about a half mile down the road is a barn. It's still there today. And at the time, it was the only house between Marietta, which is Westport again, and where the Fitzgeralds lived. And then she turns the fork, she goes down to the road, it's nighttime, and the moon comes out. He describes that there with the gleam of silver. But I am going to give you a second to read this. Wow. Now, as Charles Scribner III, now a good friend, who is he? He's the grandson of Charles Scribner's and Sons, who famously published Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Thomas Wolfe. He said, Deej, The Beautiful and Damned is the dry run for The Great Gatsby. But I found the biggest single piece of evidence there that everybody missed. Look what he's using. Look what he's test driving. The single most important color in 20th century American fiction, the green light, which symbolizes the American dream. And here he is test driving it. I mean, of all the lights he's going to use, right? And I just love his prose there where he talks about the towers, which are still there to this day, looking like a giant spider. She runs across the track on a little sidewalk, as you see to the left there. What I love is that it's described in The Beautiful and Damned as a yard wide. Yes, I'm a nut job. My dogs are named Daisy and Zelda, but I measured it. It is still 3 feet wide today. Hasn't changed. When you get halfway down the bridge and look to the right, remember 95's not there. That's what you see in the foreground. And it was deforested then. It was still largely an agrarian town in the summer of 1920. You can barely see it in the background, but you would have seen the full town. And again, they're just talking from experience here. They often took this route as a shortcut to the train station. It's a major, major shortcut. And just to pop in a story here, the original station house is still there. And what they would do is they would throw parties. It would start Thursday night. Everybody was expected to leave Sunday night. Very few people did. They stayed to Wednesday morning, and then the whole cycle would start again. So what Scott and Zelda liked to do on occasion was stay up all night. They would climb onto the roof of the station house and wait for the first train from Westport to New York. I believe it was around 5:33 a.m. Fun side note, it took 70 minutes to get to New York City from Westport then, and it takes even longer now. Okay, I'm gonna transition, all right, and I'm gonna share another PowerPoint, so just hang on, and let's get to Gatsby. Okay, perfect. I love when technology works. And again, thank you for being on yet another Zoom. I think, you know, the phrase zoom out has a new definition added to it. I think everybody's got Zoom fatigue, so I appreciate you sticking with me on this. But again, shameless plug for the book, but let's get to Gatsby. Just wanted to show you another photo of how young they were when they came out here. Again, why were they here? Scott said famously to one of his friends, if Zelda can't swim, she's miserable. So one of the reasons they came to Westport, actually the main reason, was so that she could swim in Long Island Sound. Well, as I said, you know, when I read Gatsby, it was 2 years after The Beautiful and Damned, so I was 16. I had thought about, you know, Gatsby and whether or not Westport influenced it. And there was a couple of things where I was like, yeah, you know, maybe. But it wasn't until 1996 when I read this groundbreaking article by Barbara Probst Solomon, who just passed away, called Westport Wildlife. It's the 1996 September issue. You can look it up for yourself if you'd like. And she was from Westport. She grew up across from where the Fitzgeralds were and where the mystery millionaire was, and we'll get to him in just a minute. And it was a groundbreaking interpretation of the origins of Gatsby. But here's the thing. I go back to the great Fitzgerald biographer, Matthew Bruckley. And he completely rejected her theory that it was Westport. He was all about Great Neck, Long Island. And by the way, it is also about Great Neck. It's what I call a beachy blend of both Great Neck and Westport. And it was fused. And I'll show you that through the presentation. But he pressured the New Yorker editorial board not to promote this article, and he attempted to bury it. So what happened was, as a teacher, what I did was I put together a PowerPoint, and I went around to schools, universities, and libraries, and I showed my findings. And out of this came the book, and out of this came the film. All right, well, here it is. Here's the 175-acre estate of the mystery millionaire, F.E. Lewis, who we're going to talk about in the next slide. I'm going to point out some parts of this photo. By the way, this photo was taken by a U.S. Navy blimp. I mean, you know, nobody had drones then, I don't have to tell you. And to get an aerial shot of your property was pretty rare. You know, that argues about his wealth too. But the reason the U.S. Navy stopped over his estate to take a picture was they owed him a favor. And I'll talk about why they owed him a favor in just a bit. Let me show you some segments of this photo that we will be covering. Bottom right, all right, you see this path. Okay, oops, I hope you're not seeing that. You see this path. It leads to a reflecting pool. It leads to a band shell. All right, so bottom right, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his mansion. Right here, we're going to talk about one of his 3 beaches right here. And we're going to talk about this extraordinary boathouse complex and tower. All right, all of which show up in Gatsby. Well, here he is, the mystery millionaire, F.E. Lewis. First of all, one of the reasons I really got interested in this is that in Great Neck, which I visited, they were 2.5 miles from the water. Okay, 2.5 miles. Excuse me, let me go back. In Westport, they were on the corner of a mystery millionaire's estate, and they were right by the water. So in every film and in Gatsby itself, it's exactly like Westport, and it's not at all like Great Neck. So that's one thing. There he is, very young man on the the back porch of Longshore. There's a estate called Longshore because it had a mile of shoreline, hence Longshore. There he is in the middle at the height of his powers, and there he is with a cowboy hat.
You want to see it?
At the helm of many of his boats, and I'll tell you why he's wearing a cowboy hat on the east coast of America in just a little bit. Where did he get his money? Well, at the age of 21, he inherited $240 million in today's money. And where did he get it from? His direct ancestor, a guy by the name of Moses Taylor. Yeah, I hadn't heard of him either. Tremendously powerful New York banker. He is rated in celebrityworth.net as the 21st richest American in American history. So that's where the money comes from. Here's Longshore. This is taken in the summer of 1920. A grand estate, a mansion by any standards, especially at time of the day. And when you look at it, you might say, well, this really isn't what I think of Gatsby's house from the movies. You kind of think of it as like this Versailles with these, you know, turreted mansions, you know, things like that. And it's described as such at one point in Gatsby, but in another, right at the end, it's described as that glorious ramshackle of a house. And this describes Longshore Estate pretty well, because here's the house with a lot of different architectural styles kind of glommed onto it. By the way, the entire house is still intact. There's been additions to it. And again, very popular stop on my tour. There it is. On the front is what I call the nose job. And That's the inn with a ballroom. In the back is a restaurant that you can't see. Rated the number 9th best golf course in Connecticut, and what I think is fitting, being that Scott and Zelda were here for their honeymoon, it's the number 1 wedding destination. Spectacular views in Connecticut. But I want you to look at the top center, okay? I want you to look at the top center, and you'll see these masts here, okay? These are boats, and this is now the Saugatuck Harbor Yacht Club. It's one of actually 3 yacht clubs in Westport today. Well, that was the private marina for Barbara's family. And Barbara's family owned an estate called Great Marsh that extended from this leftmost mast of a ship that's there all the way over to here. Massive. The lawns were sculpted by Frederick Law Olmsted, grand parties, Gatsby-esque in and of themselves. But sure enough, and I verified this through aerial photographs made of Connecticut during the New Deal in 1934, they had the longest dock in the vicinity. And this is where Barbara would walk to the end of the dock and look at the Mystery Millionaire's estate and think about Scott and Zelda bathing right here. This peninsula, it's now built up, but it was a full beach at that time, where they swam. And indeed, she had the longest dock in the vicinity. Indeed, there was a green great light on the end of her dock. Not only did they have a big, long dock with a green light on it, at the end of it, they had a lighthouse. So she predicated this and did a great job of convincing people. Okay, here's the entrance to Longshore. This is the Great Wall, an entrance that F.E. Lewis put in 1917. These are big posts. Now, what are big posts often called? Posterns. Okay, that's in Gatsby too. In one segment, Scott writes and Nick narrates, instead of taking the shortcut by the Sound, we went down the road a bit and entered by the, well, you're looking at them, the Great Posterns. You see, what Scott and Zelda did by living on the corner of this Mystery Millionaire's estate, by the way, when I researched him, there was one sentence on the internet on him 7 years ago, but now obviously you're going to find a lot more. But what they used to do, living on the corner of this estate, was they would take a shortcut across the property. This is also part of the tour I lead, to the Sound to swim. But sometimes, just as Nick says, we went down the road a bit and we entered by the Great Posterns. Well, there they are. It's a very popular spot on our tour. All right, look at this wonderful Gatsby-esque party. This is the summer of 1920. And at the end of that path that I showed you at the bottom right of the photo, there's the reflecting pool and there's the band shell. Scott and Zelda attended many of F.E. Lewis's parties. You can see this is a very great 20s shot where men are walking around in their summer white duck pants. You see a band here in the front and partygoers dancing in this band shell here. But what's interesting is in one segment of Gatsby, when Nick's describing Gatsby's parties, he said something to the effect like the jazz band was no mean affair, like no small affair. And it was big. It had all the instruments. And here you see a full jazz band, not just a guy with a stand-up bass, a cornet, a drum and a trumpet, right? And a saxophone. This is the full deal. So imagine coming to the east of the country for the first time, and these are your first great mansion garden parties that glitter like Gatsby's did. What you're going to see was not only that he was a millionaire, but he sculpted these grand grounds. He was a champion horse breeder. We'll be talking about that in a second. And we're going to be talking about a lot of other things that he was. So very much a Renaissance man. And this is just a picture of people riding around on his grounds, which was very common. Well, here's why he was wearing a cowboy hat in that photo behind the helm of one of his ships. You see, he owned an 8,000 acre estate on the coast of California at a place called Spadra, California. He was a champion horseman. On the right, he is on one of his Arabians. Now, Arabians were not a popular horse at the turn of the century, but F.E. Lewis popularized them. They became so popular that Buffalo Bill Cody rode F.E. Lewis's main stud Muson in all his Wild West shows. If you take a look at this ad for the sale of Duroc hogs, well, what are Durocs? They are champion hogs, and F.E. Lewis raised the best. He also put his livestock here in these massive operations. He invented a feeding system for livestock that is still in use today. And his estate was so big, 8,000 acres again, that he built a halfway house on it. So when you traveled 4,000 acres, you'd take a break for the night and then travel the other 4,000 acres. Now, he branded his cattle with a brand that was a diamond that was over a bar. So he named his ranch, not surprisingly, Diamond Bar. Well, this is now the entire city of Diamond Bar, California, to the famous alumni, the great champion soccer player Alexis Morgan, and the fun, entertaining rapper Snoop Doggy Dogg. Okay, so multi-millionaire today, again, quarter of a billionaire, and also a champion rancher and horseman. Well, he was something else too. Now, what we're going to do is you're seeing here a tower, and you're seeing in the right photo a boathouse complex, but we're not going to worry about the boathouse complex. That'll be the next slide. So I want you to, if you'd be so kind, to focus on the tower. Well, straight in Gatsby. As Nick says, Gatsby's guests were diving from the tower of his raft. And what you see here is obviously the tower, right? And here he had two giant raft swimming platforms, straight out of Gatsby. And you'll see this beach here, and the beach here, that's one of the three beaches that Scott and Zelda swam in that wonderful honeymoon summer of 1920. Okay, here's the boathouse complex. And it was a massive affair. What he would do is he would use these spars to help raise his boats. They would be taken into this entrance and stored all throughout it for winter storage. Okay, so let me just show you his main yacht in the summer of 1917. Yep, and this is one of 14 boats he owned at Longshore. Had a crew of 55, burned 4 tons of coal at sea a day, and cost $1.5 million just to keep it dry dock yearly. Now you'll notice these are US Navy sailors. Why? Well, he has this boat custom built in Stamford, Connecticut for him. And within 7 months, he gives it to the US Navy in World War I outright, and they keep it. And what it did was it patrolled Battery Park in New York City in an attempt to keep U-boats out of New York and the East Coast. That's why the Navy owed him and stopped and took a picture of his estate in 1920. Well, here he is again. Now you know why he's wearing the cowboy hat. And these are just a few of his boats. Okay. So one of the things was, you'll notice that Dan Cody is mentioned there. For those of you that might remember or are reading Gatsby, Dan Cody was where the young Jay Gats first is exposed to massive wealth. He cruised on Dan Cody's yacht and says to himself, you know what, this is what I want for the rest of my life. I want to do this. So I like to predicate that he's also the template for Dan Cody. Remember, this is, again, Scott's first time in the East. Again, the first time spending time in a massive estate of a multimillionaire. And again, right, being exposed to these great yachts. Now, 2 of his boats were called hydroplanes, all right? But hydroplane has double meaning. We'll get to the second meaning in just a little bit. But hydroplanes were incredibly fast-powered speedboats. Okay, so when you're reading Gatsby and you read that segment where Gatsby says to Nick Carraway, "Hey, Nick, why don't we jump into my hydroplane and take a spin around the Sound?" Modern readers in 1925 would have said, "Oh, wow, big powered speedboat, powered by aircraft engines, by the way." This is one of his many boats. He had 7 succeeding boats he called the Stranger over time, not at the same time, but over time. You'll see that this one is out of Los Angeles. And this is a picture taken in 1938, before it was just about to go on a deep sea cruise to Southeast Asia. It was a marine biology exploration. And, you know, at one point during an earlier one, he brought back the first seals to the San Francisco Zoo. But in 1938, he also did something else on this journey. He secretly spied for the US government on Japanese air and naval installations in Southeast Asia and reported back to the US government. And sure enough, 3 years later, the day in infamy, they would attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. Okay. Well, you're looking at another hydro, water, literally plane, hydroplane, seaplane. Okay, this picture's in 1917. And keep in mind that airplanes were brand new. So if you owned an airplane, that was a sign of tremendous wealth. If you owned a seaplane, they're so dangerous that today most insurance companies won't even insure them. That was unbelievably rare. And so when Scott writes, Gatsby saying, "Hey, old sport, let me take you for a spin around the Sound in my hydroplane," it had a double meaning to connote connotate even bigger wealth. So remember, Gatsby's only 50,000 words. It's perfectly crafted. Everything has, almost every sentence is pregnant, loaded with meaning. And Scott does this by using the single phrase hydroplane. You were supposed to think, if you were really in the know, oh my God, this guy's got a high-powered speedboat, and he's also got a seaplane. I like to say that a modern equivalent of that would be, I don't know, having your own Elon Musk rocket to, you know, go into space. Here he is with his chauffeur and his first wife. He had 4 over the course of his life. The last wife was the 18-year-old daughter of his college roommate. So that's quite the story in and of itself, and not for right now. But not only was he a yachtsman, multi-millionaire, ranch owner, and champion horse breeder, he was a motor car enthusiast. So on his estate, he had 2 cars worth today $160,000. He had a 3rd car that was worth $250,000 in today's money. Indeed, I found these 1907 to 1915 newspapers and motoring journals where he's racing. I'd like to say he never, he got into 1st place, but he never did. But he, you know, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th place finishes. One of my favorites, he loses to a car that's going at a top speed of 40 miles an hour. I love it, right? The early history of the car. Another time, he had a custom-built Cadillac. He was going to drive from Westport to California, which was no mean feat back then. He was taking a bedroll with him to sleep on the side of the road. Motels were going to start happening in the 1920s, but weren't in existence yet. Unfortunately, 50 miles into the journey, he broke down, but no problem. Rents a couple of private rail cars, pops his Cadillac on one, and comfortably takes a cross-country train trip with his car on board to Diamond Bar, California. Okay, now in 1917, he has what I still think today is the largest party in Connecticut history, hands down, and what must be one of the biggest parties in American history. I will give you some time to read the top half of the newspaper on the left and the top half of the newspaper on the right, and I'll get into this party. Okay, it's a World War I fundraiser, and he attracts the top talent in the United States to attend it so that people can come and raise money. First of all, fascinating fact, 800 cars parked at this event. Now, in 1917, not a lot of people owned cars. I don't know how many were in the state of Connecticut, but it seems to me like these were most of them. So it talks about the wealth of the attendees. By the way, I tracked down every name of the industrialists, the society people, the bankers that attended this party, and it was in the tens of billions of dollars. What he did at this party was he had airplanes carry people into the sky. Now just pretend like everybody tries to claim that your family came over on the Mayflower. All right, so we're talking 1620. Now think of 1620 to 1920, 300 years, and you are probably the first person in the entire generational history of your family to fly. Okay, so imagine the gravity of that event. Okay, Ina Claire performs there in a play. Who is she? First naturalistic actress in American history. Fitzgerald's favorite actress. He had pictures of her all over his dorm room. He wanted her to play Nicole Diver in Tender Is the Night in the 1934 film version. She was making $5,000 a week in money as it was back then, astronomical amount. And David Belasco directs her. Who's David Belasco? His ghost is said to still haunt the Belasco Theater in New York City to this day. If you go to a play, if you go to a musical and look at the stage design and lighting, it was David Belasco who set the template for it. We owe him the template for all those performances we see this day. John Philip Sousa, king of the march music, the most popular music at the turn of the century, comes with his entire band. Not only that, he performs a song specifically written for the event. Houdini does his great trick. You're able to lure Houdini, that's big name. Annette Kellerman, long forgotten, sadly, but what does she do? Champion swimmer. She invents the sport of synchronized swimming. She also creates the most radical design of a swimsuit in history. It's the one piece. Now, Zelda loved Kellerman swimsuits. They were form-fitting, they were one piece, and intentionally, she picked a kind of brown, tan, beige color so that from afar, she would look naked. That's Zelda for you, right? Marceline the Clown is there. Again, incredibly famous at that time. I think the biggest compliment to Marceline was that the biggest single film star historically in the history of cinema, Charlie Chaplin, said, hey, you know where I got my act? I copied Marceline. Marceline's the biggest clown at a time when you find 1-year residencies in Vegas of Celine Dion or Britney Spears. He did a full decade, 10 years at the Hippodrome, the main venue in New York City. He also had a comic strip that was done of him. He didn't do it, somebody did it of him. My two favorite big stories at this party was that Lewis brings in an entire circus from New York City. Half of it is taken by barge all the way to Westport. That's a good 60 miles by water. And the ramp goes down and they come onto his beach. The other half comes by private rail cars, stops in Westport, and they detrain the rest of the animals, and they march through the town of Westport. So you got airplanes, you got clowns, you got Houdini, and you got a whole animal circus. The peak of this party was all of a sudden you would hear the distant thunder of horse hooves. And over the crest of a hill came a stagecoach at top speed. Over the crest of the hill came Native Americans chasing, followed by cowboys, led by, in a big white 10-gallon hat, Effie Lewis. Now, who comes to the rescue? Here's the kicker. That's a real stagecoach from the West, from the 19th century. brought out specially. Those are real cowboys from the West, and the real kicker is those were real Native Americans. And I mean, we're talking at that time, more or less just fresh off the frontier. All day party, this is only part of the entertainment, not to, make a silly sort of analogy, but literally, this was a three-ring circus where there was entertainment going on all throughout the 175-acre estate, which it still is to this day, and you can visit it and walk the roads, all of which are original. Take a second to read these headlines. So not only did they come to Westport, they come to Westport in the first year of Prohibition. They come to a town that completely ignored Prohibition, voted it down 3-2 in a mock election. They come to one of the only two states that never ratified Prohibition, Connecticut and Rhode Island. Why is that? At that time, they had the largest per capita population of Italian Americans. The role of wine in the sacrament and growing your own grapes, integral to the culture. And what I found when I did this research starting about 7 years ago was it still, Connecticut and Rhode Island still have the largest number of Italian Americans per capita to this day. The police numbered 4 in Westport. Half of them were Italian Americans, 2 of them, so they didn't care about Prohibition. The other half were Irish, and I can say this, having significant Irish blood, that you're not going to find a lot of Irishmen that are going to be interested in enforcing Prohibition. As a matter of fact, all the busts in town were done by the feds. Now, take a look at the top center. I'm going to talk about 2 of these. Headline, truck carrying $17,000 worth of booze held up. You'll notice it's on its way to Rhode Island. That's a cool $250,000 today, folks. So that's one thing. Bottom left, the taxi that overturns downtown. The people in the town saw this taxi a lot. They never saw it at night, and they noticed that it always stopped for gas at Westport, same gas station that Scott and Zelda used, by the way. And they found out why. Because the headlights were full of booze, they didn't function. The fenders were full of booze. The wheel wells, the side panels, and needless to say, the trunk was full of it. But also the gas tank had been cut in half. Only half of it contained gas, the other half contained booze, hence their need to stop frequently for gas. So they are in the absolute Wild West of ignoring Prohibition. Top right, you see that there's 16 stills operated in Westport. It wouldn't photograph well. It was really, really bad microfilm. But another article from the local paper that summer says that 60 stills, 60, were operating in Westport. Okay. Take a second to read the article on the left, and then just take a quick look at the most famous speakeasy on the East Coast, the Miramar, a mile away from the Fitzgeralds' home at that time. All right, what Scott and Zelda did, so the Miramar, the biggest speakeasy between New York and Boston. You just took a right off the post road and boom, you were there. One of the favorites of Jimmy Cagney, George Raft, Humphrey Bogart, and obviously you're going to find Scott and Zelda there, right? And on the left article from the summer of 1920, you see that Scott is going there. They're probably tanked before they left the house, almost can guarantee it, and he gets in an accident. But notice what he does. He uses it and recycles it in Gatsby, okay? Remember, all my characters are of Scott Fitzgerald, as he said. The car loses a wheel. And in one of the party scenes in Gatsby, one of the guests crashes the car. And yes, what's the single thing he describes? The wheel is off of it. Okay. So again, straight out of Westport, straight into Gatsby. The other major speakeasy, and I'll talk about the gentleman on the right in a second, was the Compo Inn. And again, in the 1920s, if it was a restaurant, it essentially doubled as a speakeasy. And down that steep drive, we have two eyewitness accounts of Zelda riding the hood of a taxi, hanging on to the hood of the taxi for dear life, careening down the hill towards the post road. And in one of those accounts, she's naked. You can pick whatever account you want, but it's a great story. And to the right is Bald Jack Rose, one of the leading rum runners in the 1920s. He was the brother-in-law. He controlled all of the booze in Westport. He was the brother-in-law of Jake Levy, who owned the Compo Inn. But here is a stunning link. You see, Bald Jack Rose was in a very, very, very famous event in American history, and it shows up in Gatsby. You might remember when Nick goes with Gatsby and meets Meyer Wolfsheim, and Meyer Wolfsheim talks about the murder of Rosie Rosenthal at the Metropole. Well, Bald Jack Rose turned state's evidence against the corrupt cops that were involved in that case and got Captain Charles Becker indicted, and eventually he was electrocuted at Sing Sing. So it's not much of a hop and a skip and a jump to think about Bald Jack Rose. By the way, why was he called Bald Jack? He had alopecia. Bald Jack Rose as also the template for Meyer Wolfsheim. All right, take a couple of seconds to see these headlines. They come into a town that is party central. There are orgies going around. And indeed, Edmund Wilson, the great critic, the great literary critic of the time, says in a letter that Scott and Zelda were engaged in the nude orgies of Westport. So, I mean, put it all together, this is the Roaring Twenties personified. When he sells the estate in 1925, it's just featured in Country Life magazine. I just wanted to show you that. Again, what are they selling? The 175 acres and the 6 baths and the fireproof stables and the formal sculpted gardens. But, you know, Country Life at that time was obviously catering to a wealthy crowd. And we're coming soon to the end of the presentation and soon to the film clip I'm going to show you. But this is the film that came out. It's called Gatsby in Connecticut, and it's won several awards. What we're very, very proud of, my friend Robert Stephen Williams, who directed this film, was that the New Yorker published what it considered the top 36 films in the country from 2020, the entire year in every film. And the film came in at number 30. And it's on multiple platforms, streaming. You can, you know, get the DVD on Amazon, things like that. All right, last thing I want to talk about in these images presentation. Again, there's their honeymoon house, and again, there's Scott and Zelda. What's fun about this photo? Now, remember, they were there in 1920 for the honeymoon. They return in 1924 for a photo op for his short story, The Cruise of the Rolling Junk, which was also featured in Motoring magazine. So notice it's 1924 and they come back to Westport. That's a year before Gatsby's published. So what I like to predicate is that, you know, a year before Gatsby is published, they come back and he's re-familiarizing himself with the geography of Westport, which again shows up in The Great Gatsby. Okay. I'm going to stop the share and transition to the film. I'm going to show you about a 3-minute clip. I got to make sure that the sound is on. That should be it. Who are you going to see in this? All right, you're going to see Sam Waterston, who famously played Nick Carraway in the '74 version, my favorite. You're going to see Bobby Lanahan, one of the three Fitzgerald grandchildren. You're going to see Charles Scribner III, who's self-explanatory, and I told you he's the grandson of Charles Scribner and Sons. And you're going to see Walter Robichek, who is a leading Fitzgerald academic historian. So here we go. 3-minute clip from our film.
Who was Jay Gatsby modeled on?
I find it interesting that so many people are digging into who were the sources for Gatsby. There have been some specific names proposed, and then there have been other theories, so we may never know.
I heard he was in oil from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Texas.
I knew somebody who grew up with him in St. Paul.
Well, you look at him sometimes when he doesn't know anyone's looking at him. You can see it in his eyes. I bet he did kill a man.
Which one is he?
Yes, there is something ultimately about Gatsby that we never quite know.
You're not supposed to be able to grasp it.
Right,
Yeah.
his essence, yeah.
But I don't think there's any one person who served as a model for Gatsby.
He took his experience, of course, as you're saying, it all comes from your own experience, but he blends different times of his life, different people he knew, with himself, and creates composites. In fact, Hemingway wrote him a famous letter criticizing him for that. You should base one character on one person, like I do. Like
Really?
Hemingway does, yeah.
You could have the ambition and the pretense that you would be able to see so thoroughly into another person's character that no part of you would show up in the description.
And
I'm not sure I believe
No,
that.
I don't either. And I think Fitzgerald wrote him back and rejected.
It all converges on Gatsby, and Gatsby is inexhaustible.
All those people who claim to have a piece of Scott's original raw material in their community, they might have a partial truth.
Everyone's colored by their own prejudice of where they grew up. So when we interview people from Long Island, they're all convinced Gatsby's from Long Island.
The danger of writing a book about Gatsby is that you then hear from all these people all over the world who've got the key.
We're not supposed to read Gatsby and think Westport. That wasn't Fitzgerald's intention. He wanted us to read Gatsby and think Long Island. But since he didn't have those experiences on Long Island, since they came out of his magic year of 1920 on Westport, where he had a beach, he had a cottage next to a mysterious recluse, that's what he's using as his model.
I think the interesting thing about all of these speculations and surmises and everything is that it's great if it enlivens the book. It's awful if it weighs it down.
My father was on the scene when we started to lose our way during Gatsby's time, and he recorded it all. The generosity, the greed, the innocence, and the cynicism, the magnificence and the waste that was America between the two world wars. People read him now for clues and guidelines, as if by understanding him and his beautiful and damned period, they could see more clearly what's wrong.
The thing that jumps out for me is she also puts in and his beautiful and damp period, which is...
I can see that puts it right in your movie.
Yeah.
Okay, the wonderful Bobby Lanahan. And again, I have stopped sharing the screen, and I hope you see my handsome visage. Happy to, I don't see any chat questions, so looks like we're not going to have to take any of those. If anybody wants to unmute and ask any questions, very happy to answer any. And what I'll do, as people get ready, if they want to do that, again, you're probably all zoomed out, as I said. One of the things is we've been through, again, I mentioned how a century ago, the Fitzgeralds were going through an identical nationwide crisis and global crisis that we had. But what I think is going to happen in one way or the other is that what was after all those disastrous things in 1919, 1920, you had the Roaring 20s, and it's almost identical. They were absorbing new technologies, radio, car, plane, even television. We're absorbing new technologies with the internet. And what resulted after the end of all this difficulty? The Roaring Twenties. So I like to think that we are poised for, and I'm not unique in this, for a gigantic revival of everything, including probably a lot of partying. So again, it doesn't look like we have any questions. I really appreciate everybody joining us. We may have a question from our wonderful co-host, Andrew.
An observation and a question. I don't know if you've ever heard, but Scott and Zelda spent a while down here in Virginia Beach at the Cavalier Hotel, from which they were also evicted for their behavior. But I guess my biggest question is, why is his biographer so resistant to the idea? And
well, yeah, you know what? Great. Seriously, Andrew, that's like the biggest question. Not only does he reject it, but Broccoli comes to Westport and rents my best friend's house for a summer, and he's living here doing research. I don't know. You know what I think it is? It's what did the Greeks call it? Hubris.
hubris.
Yeah. And again, it just didn't fit what he thought. He saw himself as the god of Fitzgerald biography, which he is. And by the way, I recommend people read all of his stuff. He's incredible. What he's done is second to none. But on this one, he had a blind spot. Great question. And there is a question from Peter. Hope I'm pronouncing that because there's an I in there. After all this hard partying, what happened to them later? Well, great question. I'll give you the shortcut because I don't want to give you their whole biography. Within 10 years, Zelda is institutionalized. Again, what you got to try to remember is their youth. She was 19 in Westport. By 29, she's in and out for the rest of her life in an institution. She dies in a fire in an institution 8 years after Scott dies. What does Scott do? He dies at the age of 44 from alcoholism. He spent at least 5 times drying out in hospitals. By the way, he'd be there for days being intravenously fed. I mean, this is serious alcoholism. When he attempted to quit drinking, well, he did quit for a while when he was out in California, but before then, his first attempt to quit drinking was he stopped drinking gin, and he replaced it with drinking 36 beers a day. So sobriety to Scott was six packs a day. God bless him, Irish blood, that'll do it to you. So Andrew, thanks a million. Avery, thanks a million. Again, you're all so lucky to live in Williamsburg. It is hands down one of my favorite places in the United States. And again, I have often fantasized about moving there. So everybody stay safe. I think most of us will be immunized, by the fall. And let's have fun. Yeah, let's have fun. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thanks a lot, Avery.
Thanks so much, Richard.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Great
Bye.
presentation.
Thank you.